Please be seated. Paul writes, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. In a New York Times column last month about the rise of the nuns, people who no longer have any religious affiliation, Donald McLaughlin, a 29-year-old former Pentecostal who grew up in a small black church on the south side of Chicago, described his falling away from Christianity. He said, I started to notice that the distance between what we professed in church and what we actually did, especially when it came to women, the LGBT community, and Black Lives Matter. And when he and his wife tried a more modern church, he noticed the same patterns, just repackaged, he said, in a kind of cool, shiny way. And it is this wide gap between who Christians say they are and how they live their lives that made the faith seem inauthentic to Donald McLaughlin, which led him to abandon the church and Christianity. He is not alone. In a survey done last year by the Episcopal Church, in partnership with the global market research company Ipsos, the number one characteristic that non-believers associate with Christians is hypocrisy. Over 55% of non-believers said this. What then should we do with today's reading from Romans? When Paul writes, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Is he just the first in a long line of hypocrites who follow Jesus? Christians who say one thing but do another? Or does a Christian make a real difference in a person's life? Should we expect Christians to behave with a higher standard of morality and ethics? And if that's the case, then how do we understand Paul's words in Romans 7? A priest named Simplician was so disturbed by this passage that he wrote to the greatest theologian of his time and requested an explanation of what Paul meant. St. Augustine's response was twofold. First, Augustine said that the Apostle Paul here is not speaking about himself. Even though he writes I, Paul is not writing autobiographically. At the time he wrote the letter to the Romans, Paul had experienced his dramatic conversion on the Damascus Road. He had spent years planting churches throughout the Mediterranean. The desperate confusion we hear in the Romans passage, Augustine said, does not sound like a man who could do all these things. Instead, Augustine said that Paul was speaking hypothetically. He was putting himself in the place of someone who is not a Christian and giving voice to that person's existential struggles. It is only someone who does not know Jesus Christ who is drawn to do wrong because of what Augustine called the deceptive sweetness of forbidden sin, who struggles this way. That doesn't seem to describe Paul after his conversion, Augustine thought, and it does not really describe any other Christian. Instead, Augustine wrote, the more a Christian does the will of God, the more the Christian delights in doing the will of God, and the easier it gets. And so the implication of Augustine's response is that that young man from Chicago is right to leave the church and the Christian faith because of this distance between what Christians say and what they do. Hypocrisy is fatal to Christian witness. Now, Simplician first met Augustine just a few years before he wrote to him. At the time of their meeting, Simplician was an elderly, wise priest known throughout Milan for his pastoral wisdom. Augustine was a young man, about 30 years old. He had recently been appointed the professor of rhetoric at the university, and he was not a Christian. Although seemingly at the beginning of a promising career, though Augustine came to Milan already disillusioned, all the intellectual certainties of his youth were lost. He wasn't sure what he believed anymore. He was searching for new answers since pagan philosophy had failed to satisfy him. In short, he was having an existential crisis. And so it's in this state of turmoil that Augustine comes to church and seeks out Simplician. And taking a look at this young and confused professor, Simplician counseled Augustine in a way that eventually led to his conversion to Christianity. A year later, Augustine would be baptized. 4 years after that, he would be ordained a priest. And 4 years after that, he would be elected the bishop coadjutor of Hippo. And so when Augustine writes to Simplician about the meaning of today's passage in Romans, Augustine is still very much in the early stages of his journey. He's only been a Christian for a few years. And I think that explains his answer. People who are not familiar with our faith, either new Christians or non-believers, they can sometimes have an optimistic, even magical belief in the power of conversion. And after all the struggles in his life, I suspect that Augustine's conversion to Christianity came to him as a relief. He must have felt, now I will finally be free from all of my struggles. And maybe you have felt this way too. Maybe you thought that when you accepted Jesus Christ, when you became a Christian, when you were baptized or confirmed, you started coming to church, that would put an end to all your struggles, or at least reduce them. In a book written just 3 years before his death called The Retractions, Augustine will change his mind. He will write that the I in Romans 7 should be understood as Paul himself, that Paul writes autobiographically, not hypothetically, that even after his dramatic conversion on the Damascus Road, even after all those years planting churches throughout the Mediterranean, that yes, Paul continued to struggle deeply to follow God's will for his life. And Augustine says this, I think, because now he's had decades of experience as a Christian, as a bishop, and he has a better understanding of what this journey entails. As Augustine writes in The Retractions, it was not until long afterwards that I realized that these words of Paul could apply as well as, and is more likely to apply to, the spiritual person. More likely to apply to the spiritual person. You see, becoming a Christian does not mean we don't struggle. All of us in the church are aware of what that young man from Chicago described. There is a distance between what we profess and what we do. And we're also aware of how hard it is to close this gap. So often we are divided against ourselves. So often we cry out with the Apostle Paul, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. But that is not a reason to give up Christianity. That is not a reason to leave the church. It is precisely this struggle within our divided selves, wanting to live as God calls us to live, and yet so often falling short of that standard, that holds the possibility of our redemption. In this struggle is our hope. Augustine once wrote that yearning makes the heart grow deep. Yearning makes the heart grow deep. And it is our yearning to be like Jesus Christ, not our accomplishment of that goal, which we must inevitably fall short of, but it is our yearning that is the beginning of our journey on the way, not its end. It is our yearning to be finally made whole, to no longer have a divided self that makes us follow Jesus. So to that young man from Chicago, and to all who have left the church and Christianity, let me say this. We confess in the church that there is a distance between what we say and what we do. We admit that we are so often like the Apostle Paul. We do not do what we want, but we do the very thing that we hate. And maybe the same is true for you. And if you feel disturbed or angry or despairing or despondent because of this distance between what you want to do and what you actually do, if you yearn to close that gap, then come. Join us on the way. Your yearning marks the beginning of your Christian journey, not its end.